Good evening. Hello. My name is Ellie Hayes, and I am the Executive Director for Missouri Cures Education Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our Brews and Breakthroughs here in Kansas City. Missouri Cures is a statewide nonprofit that works to promote and protect medical research in the state. We want to make sure that any research that's legal in other areas of the country remains legal here in Missouri, and that any treatments that are FDA approved also remain legal here in Missouri. So, we put on these educational events all around the state. This is our second Brews and Breakthroughs of the year. We also do our Lunch with the Researcher events. We have some women in research events that we do. And then next year we're doing a symposium on neuro research. So we're excited about all those things coming up. And I encourage you to check out our newsletter to find out about all of those. We also highlight every month a researcher and a woman in research that are working here in the state of Missouri, as well as incredible research discoveries that are happening around the country. Tonight, though, we're really excited to introduce Katiana Hebbert. She is a third-year medical student at Kansas City University of Osteopathic Medicine. And she is passionate about contributing to cures for pancreatic cancer and raising overall health awareness. She looks forward to serving as a physician in marginalized communities and giving back to those who do not have helping hands to outstretch to them. She works in Dr. Sarsour's lab, is where she made her discovery, and he's here joining us tonight, so thank you. And without further ado, I give you Katiana.
Hello, thanks so much, Ellie. I appreciate that. I'm Katiana Hebbert. I'm a third-year medical student. I'm coming from Kansas City University, so I am local. And before we jump in to the juicy stuff, I'll give you a little bit more on my background and how I ended up in research. So I'm originally from Brooklyn, New York. I went to school upstate New York. I went to SUNY Albany. After I graduated from undergrad, I moved to California for a couple of years. And following that, I proceeded and came into medical school. So I came out here to Kansas City. And I found Dr. Sarsour because he was actually a teacher during my first year of medical school. And he talked a little bit about his research, and he was already doing some things in pancreatic cancer. And I just cold emailed him and I said, hey, I want to join your lab. I want to do something and I want to change and I'm motivated. And at that time, I actually had no experience in research, and I'm not sure that he was super impressed by that track record, but I said, I'm motivated and I'll do what it takes. I'll come in and I'll wash glassware. I'll stand in the corner until a spot opens up. And by some wind of the mill, he actually said yes. And so here we are today. And now I'm a third-year student. We've made some pretty good and interesting discoveries. As far as my personal experience, I know a good amount of people, actually, unfortunately, who are currently afflicted with cancer, some that have already passed away from cancer. And I also have family and friends and loved ones who have the same experience of having people fighting cancer now and having people pass away. And I'm sure many of you in the room tonight probably have that experience as well. And as you know, when a loved one or family has an illness, especially something like cancer, you all go through it. So you all have cancer as well with them, and you're in for the ride. And so I have a personal vendetta against cancer, which is why I was extremely motivated to join Dr. Sarsour's lab and make some discoveries and join the fight against pancreatic cancer. Joining on that topic now, pancreatic cancer is extremely deadly. When we talk about pancreatic cancer, most often people remember Patrick Swayze. We think about Steve Jobs. We think about Aretha Franklin. Some of you may or may not know, and our beloved Alex Trebek. Pancreatic cancer, it has a 11.5% survival rate as far as their 5-year survival rate goes, which is the smallest number among cancers. As far as 2030 goes, upcoming, pancreatic cancer is slated to become the second leading cause of cancer death. When you look at that in comparison to some of the counterparts, such as breast cancer, since the 1990s, pancreatic cancer survival rate hasn't really moved much versus something like breast cancer. It's on an increasing upward trend, which is great, but that also tells us a number of things about pancreatic cancer. It tells us we're not making any differences, we're not making any strides, we're not winning the battle. And as far as effective therapies for pancreatic cancer, when you look at the incidence compared to the death rate, it stays in the top 5. And so effective therapies are not one that's really there for pancreatic cancer. And that might drive you to think about, well, what are the therapies that we do have? Why isn't it working? And that's exactly where we jumped in. So some of the therapies that are available now, it includes radiation therapy, there's chemotherapy, there's surgery, and then there's different various targeted therapies. But the problem is not so much on the therapies, it's the pancreas itself. It's a tricky guy, it's in a tricky location, it's nestled deep behind the stomach, it's near the spleen, it's in contact with major vessels and arteries and veins. And so for something like pancreatic cancer, we can refer to it as a car for right now. When you have all these vessels nearby, it's a perfect highway. So it makes it an aggressive cancer. So it can travel all over the body. Because of its neighboring organs and all the vessels that are surrounding it, it makes it really hard to resect that kind of cancer. So the risks don't really outweigh the benefits. And then because of that, as far as the location, it's tricky setup in the body, it doesn't really lend well for radiation either. And for that reason, only 15% of people that are affected with pancreatic cancer, and more specifically, I'll be talking about pancreatic ductal adenocarcinoma, which is a second term as far as the big umbrella of pancreatic cancer. That's what makes it so deadly. People are not qualified to have that pancreatic cancer removed. When we look a little bit more into PDAC, which is pancreatic ductal adenocarcinoma, and I'll refer to it as that for the rest of my presentation, research has demonstrated that they're actually resistant to standard of care therapies. It's resistant to radiation and chemotherapy, and that's because they have strong desmoplastic features. Don't get nervous. I'm going to explain what that means. So strong desmoplastic features refers to a stroma. So if you'll close your eyes for a second, imagine a ping pong ball. Now take that ping pong ball and smash it in the middle of some slime. There'll be a surrounding stroma. Let's imagine that as our stroma. And the slime or the surrounding cells, our stroma, they're actually made up of non-malignant cells, and that includes something called fibroblasts. Most often with PDAC, we find that the tumor is 20% of the cancer, but the stroma is actually 80%. And the stroma is really important, and we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight, because the stroma is what lends therapy barriers, and they provide mitogenic signals to the cancer. So the tumor is essentially centered and shielded. Preliminary results from our lab and other labs have shown that the stroma, it's also aging affects the stroma. The older the stroma, the more mitogenic signals to the PDAC cells, and that continues to create this cycle of conferring resistance to therapy. And so as far as the stroma goes, we have discovered that in the stroma, as I previously stated, fibroblast cells exist. And fibroblast cells, what they do is they supplement free fatty acids and different metabolic downstream items to the tumor to help proliferation and the resistance to therapy. When it comes to pancreatic cancer, aging is very important. Most often, the median age for the diagnosis of pancreatic cancer is 70. And then following up on that, the median age for death is 72. So the time gap is really small in between. Diagnosed at 70, die at 72, not a lot of therapies available, not a lot of things work. It's an asymptomatic cancer for the most part. You don't really know you have it until it's everywhere already. And that's the unfortunate part. And yes, we can argue that there are blood markers. We have CEA, we have CA19, which some of you might be familiar with already, but they don't tell us anything as far as diagnosing. We don't know, and these markers don't move until you're already at stage 4. And so we looked a little bit more into how aging affects the stroma. So when we looked at the fibroblasts that make up the stroma, so keep that ping pong ball in your head and our slime surrounding, and we saw that as far as the genomics go, when we looked at the fibroblasts and how they age and what they affect, we saw that the number one disease that correlates with aged fibroblasts is cancer. Took it a step further, and then we looked at, well, what's happening there? What's going on? And so what we found was that there's a specific pathway that's actually really affected in the fibroblasts once they age. And the number one pathway affected on a cellular level is lipid metabolism. And so we went ahead and we kind of thought a little bit more on this aspect. So aging, higher lipid metabolism. So you're probably thinking something gets better as we age. Yes, lipid metabolism gets better. You get more lipids. And so why does that happen? This happens because there's a protein that normally stops or inhibits lipid metabolism. And this protein, GOS2, this stops the lipid metabolism. Unfortunately, as we age, this decreases over time. So nothing is stopping the lipid metabolism then as we age. And this is especially important because that's what's happening in these fibroblasts that are continuing to feed our cancer, more specifically our pancreatic cancer. We went ahead and we looked at that in the lab, and we took a glance and checked out 3-day fibroblasts, and we looked all the way up until 70 years old fibroblasts. And what we saw was, yeah, the free fatty acids increase, and they increase by a significant fold. And their metabolites also increase downstream as well. So fibroblasts, they're getting older, they're stopping, the lipid metabolism is stopping, increasing. The inhibitor protein is stopping, and that's contributing to the stroma. So naturally we postulated, well, what if we just go through that lipid metabolism and see what happens to the stroma? Would it make the cancer weaker? Would we be able to get around that shield per se? So that was what we set out to do. We repurposed an FDA-approved drug that is used as an anti-lipid drug, and we put it on the cancer. So for anyone that is lost right now, the big picture is this. We have a stroma, we have some fibroblast cells, and these are giving signals to our cancer cells. They're letting off free fatty acids, they're letting off the metabolites, and so we're coming in, we're stopping this process of this lipid metabolism and its metabolites, and hoping that we'll weaken that stroma, we'll weaken the shield, and everything else can penetrate better at that rate. Who's with me? Yeah. Great. Okay, so then the follow-up question becomes, well, okay, that's our thought process, but what if fibroblasts don't actually make free fatty acids? And what if this drug that we put on, what if it doesn't actually decrease anything? So we did that. We took out fibroblasts by themselves. We took out our stroma by themselves. We looked at how much free fatty acid they were producing. Then we went ahead and put our drug on, and we noticed that the free fatty acid production decreased. We looked at all the metabolites that come downstream, and those decreased as well. Okay, what about when we put them together, right? So we put them together, we put our fibroblasts and our PDAC cells, which is our pancreatic cancer cells, and what we saw was that our control group without our medications, free fatty acid production was extremely high. We went ahead and put our drugs and we put them in increasing amounts, and we saw that free fatty acid production decrease. Okay, well, how do we know that the fibroblasts even help the PDAC cells to grow? So we grew them separately. We grew our PDAC cells without the surrounding fibroblasts. They grew, but then we added our fibroblasts and they grew even more. So they need the fibroblasts. They need their stroma. And this microenvironment is what is really helping them to proliferate, helping them to stand tall against all our standard of care therapies. So thanks to science, we have a system called the Fuji system, and this is a fluorescent lighting system. And what we're able to do with this Fuji system is we can actually look at the cells individually and look at their life cycle. So what's happening? Are we affecting the cells themselves? Are they actually dying? Are they stopping? So when we looked at that and we used our system, we saw that the number of lit up cells who were living before we put our drug on top of it, there were dozens and dozens of cells that were living. And once we put our drug on, those lights quieted down, which is pretty great. So I'll get a little bit more into the cell cycle now. The cell cycle is pretty important. And for my science nerds out there, we have our G1, we have our S, we have our G2, we have our M. So these are our stop and go cycles. So essentially, we're looking at the cell cycle individually. We're zeroing in now on a microscopic level. Are we stopping them? Are we halting them? What's happening? And what we found was that now we're looking at everything together, all our co-cultured cells. So our stroma and our cancer. We know that the cancer needs the stroma. So now we're looking at them as a whole. So we applied our drugs and we saw that as a control, our cancer, without the drug, they naturally were going into their go phase. When we applied our cancer, hopefully adjuvant therapy on top of them, they stopped going into the go phase. They halted. When we looked at our stop phase, without our drug on top, there weren't many cells in the stop phase, which makes sense because it's cancer. It just keeps on going. When we looked at our stop phase with our drug on top, we saw that there was an exponential increase of cells in their stop phase, which is pretty great. But that wasn't the main objective of the study. Yes, this is great, it works. But again, when we're in the lab, we have to remember that these trials, we're hopeful that they go to clinical trials, right? What do they mean for everybody else? What do they mean for people that are afflicted? How is this going to help them? What are we going to do? And so we applied this with our standard of care therapies. We know that radiation, when you can, it works. We know the chemotherapy, when you can, it does work as well. Well, we went ahead and we took a look at what would happen if we compared them, and then what would happen if we combined all of them. So for our first round, what we did was we went ahead and we just double checked one more time. And this time, instead of checking at one concentration, this drug, we checked at multiple concentrations. And what we saw was that every time we increased our concentration of the drug, the cells were dying more, and they were dying at a higher rate as well. FOLFIRINOX is the common chemotherapy that is used for pancreatic cancer as a treatment. And so what we did was we put our pancreatic cancer cells, we went ahead and applied the chemotherapy. We saw that it worked. That was our control. We then went ahead and used our chemotherapy in our standard quantities, and we added our drug, and we added it in the increasing quantities once again, and we saw that that actually worked way better than just the chemotherapy by itself. Naturally, the next thing we did was we compared it with the radiation. We had our radiation, it did kill the cells, we know that works. And then we added on our drug on top of the radiation. Again, exponential decrease in that growth. So now the burning question. What happened when we combined all three? And we did that, and we did it in the increasing quantities. We had our chemotherapy and our radiation as our control. And yes, the cells did decrease in their growth, but when we added on our drug in our increasing quantities in micromolars, for anyone that's curious, so we're still a pretty small amount, we saw that there was a significant decrease in the growth of our cells. And this is really important, and it blew our minds, because this is great. If this can be an adjuvant therapy for patients that are battling pancreatic cancer, and if we can layer on this drug onto what we already know works but make it better, then we might have a fighting chance. So what does this all mean? If we wrap it up and we really think about it, we know that chemotherapy is very toxic for the body. It gives a lot of burden to the people that are actually going through the therapy. You lose your hair. Sometimes you might get a secondary cancer on top of that. Radiation, it yields the same effects. And while it might be beneficial in some ways, it's still very harmful for the body. And that's how we discovered chemotherapy. It's a toxin. And that's unfortunately the truth behind that. So if we could use things that work, but lower the toxic burden for the patient, then we increase the quality of their life. And whenever we do things in the lab, we always have to remember this is going to affect a life. We can harm, we can help, we can hurt. And what we're hoping is that we can help. And when someone is going through these therapies, the quality of their life is significantly hindered. And whenever we want to help a patient, we don't just want something that works. We want something that works, but also improves the duration and the quality of their life. No one wants to be alive and be sick the entire time and throwing up and vomiting. And so that was a really key factor and a part of this research. And right now we're hoping that this will go to clinical trials and really help the lives of humans that are suffering. And the end all of our research is always, how can we help the face behind this? We can't just do work in a lab and forget about the human side to it, especially when it comes to research that touches on topics like cancer. So we're hopeful that this will go pretty far. Really excited, and so far the benefits have been great. We're happy to see that it's working. We're happy to see that potentially this could be an adjuvant therapy for standard of care that already exists. A very important point as well, as far as our research go, is that we were able to find a metabolic checkpoint. And we were able to induce what's called the G1 metabolic checkpoint. This is very important because we've never kind of toyed with the idea of being creative with checkpoints. And so our drug, we were able to find, we can affect, not only are we having a big picture, but if you zoom in on a small microscopic level, we're affecting the cell cycle. We're affecting every individual cell at this rate. So this is extremely important, very clinically significant, and it's outstanding results. And we're hopeful that this will go far, and we're hopeful that this will touch the lives of many others and kind of get the word out there. So I just want to say thanks for being here tonight. Thanks for your interest. Thanks for taking the time out of your day, for scheduling, for spreading the word, hopefully, and hopefully getting this somewhere. And before I wrap up, I just want to say research is a really big task. And so without the team behind it, it's not a one-man job. So everywhere I go, and if I talk about what we're doing in the lab, I have to mention the other people that are behind as well. So Abby Wojitas, Jaden Kennedy, Dr. Goswami, Dr. Seltzer, as well as Cami Pearson, because if it was a one-man job, it'd be extremely difficult to get done. So thank you so much, guys.
And before we all leave, we want to be able to open it up to you for questions, both here in Kansas City and virtually for those of you who are joining us. So just, do you have any virtual questions, Stephen?
Yeah. First one. Can this kind of treatment be used to help other kinds of cancers, or is it just specific for pancreatic?
So what we discovered with this stroma, it's actually a very unique feature of PDAC cells and pancreatic cancer. So for now, we are just solely focused on this unique feature to pancreatic cancer.
Sorry, we just have the one mic. Do you have any other questions, Stephen, or do we have any here? Oh, yes, sir, you. Hold on one second. I'm going to give you the mic so that we can hear you.
I'm sorry, this was the common drug.
What was the common drug that you're testing?
So unfortunately, at this time, because we're still under research, we're actually not allowed to say the name of the drug. I'm sorry about that.
But it's already approved for other purposes.
It's already FDA approved, and the quantities that we use are actually non-toxic to cells. So that would be something to be regulated in human trials as well.
Larry, what's your question?
I'm really curious about like the specificity of the drugs. Lots of things we put on cells, kill stuff. How did you make sure that the drug was specific to the cancer cell compared to your normal wild type cell?
So I'm gonna repeat the question, or if you want to repeat the question, I just want to make sure the people that are joining us virtually can hear it. He said, quite curious about the specificity of the drug and what makes, I'm sorry, I lost it. One more time.
Oh, what makes as far as being able to kill cancer?
What makes it able to kill cancer versus other cells?
That's a great question. So the fibroblasts are what make up the stroma more specifically, and then they go down the pathway of lipid metabolism. So more specifically, when we looked at that pathway, the GOS-S2 protein actually normally inhibits a ATGL. And so the drug that we use since that inhibitor is no longer available, especially in large quantities, we actually use that same pathway, and the drug specifically inhibits ATGL as well.
Very cool, so you're targeting an aberrant of cancer that's not found in almost very cool.
So we have another question from online, virtual question. And what is the next steps? You mentioned going to clinical trials. What is the next step before you can get to clinical trials?
So we are actually still raising funds, and we're applying for grants at this time and looking to get approval for grants and funds. And so the entire process actually is a little bit dependent on financial assistance for the next steps.
Does anybody else have any questions? Oh, yeah, right here. So she's wondering if and Katiana's original intent was to focus on pancreatic cancer, and if not, what was the road that got her there?
This is a personal question for me, correct? Okay. I just knew that I wanted to tackle cancer, and I was very motivated to get into that field, and I wanted to go into a field where there was no hope or it was grim, and pancreatic cancer is one of those cancers where the hope is grim, especially on the quick turnaround time. So that really motivated me to be a part of change, and that was the ultimate goal. We got to beat this thing. Oh, yeah.
Oh, would you like to, please step up, please step up.
Okay, this is just a comment because question was asked here, and we get this question because really the new concept is very innovative. What Katiana did is very innovative. Everyone thinks that we are actually targeting the cancer. We are not. We already have radiation and chemo to target the cancer. What we are doing is targeting the cells around the cancer, the normal cells. That's the question. And I like this question because you put anything in cancer cells, they start dying. Really, cancer cells are weak, but the problem with them, they change all the time. Normal cells don't change, and that's the effectiveness of our drug. It's targeting the normal cells around the cancer, not the cancer cells. And that's what actually Katiana was really good at. Is like, why are not targeting the cancer? I say, everyone is doing that. Let's do something different.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Katiana and Dr. Sarsar, for that explanation. And thank you so much to Strange Day Brewing for hosting us this evening. Can we all have a round of applause for them? And I encourage you to maybe hit the bar and have another drink before you head out. Well, you know, safely, maybe a non-alcoholic drink. Thank you so much, everybody who's joining us virtually. We really appreciate your support. And again, MissouriCures.org, if you'd like any more information about what's happening in our organization or upcoming events. We're really excited. We're going to be back here in Kansas City on February 8th. We are featuring a screening of a movie called The Human Trial, and it follows both the first two patients for a clinical trial on what's called the external pancreas. It's for type 1 diabetes patients, and it follows the first two clinical trial patients, and then also the researchers that developed this, and their process through the regulatory process and the funding process. And it's a very interesting and heartwarming film, and I hope you can all join us. It'll be at the Kaufman Center. Everybody who's here should be signed up on our newsletter now, and so we'll make sure you get the information. And those of you joining us at home, we'll make sure you get the information as well. Thank you so much and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.